Amara sat quietly in the back row of her music class, her fingers drumming lightly on the desk as she listened to Mr. Carter, the new music teacher, talk about the importance of musicality. The buzz of excitement in the room was palpable as the students exchanged eager glances, but Amara's mind wandered. She wasn't just excited for the class, she was nervous. Mr. Carter's arrival had stirred something in her. The man had barely glanced at her before dismissing her in his mind. He was like that with people. The way he looked at the students, especially the ones like Amara, made her feel like an afterthought, a distraction rather than a person with talent. Amara had always been an outsider in many spaces. She wasn't the type to make waves or draw attention to herself, but she had always been quietly confident in her ability to play the piano. The only thing that worried her now was what Mr. Carter would think. She had already felt the sting of judgment before, the assumption that she couldn't be good enough because of the color of her skin or the assumptions about what kind of music she liked. Being black in a predominantly white school meant that she often had to fight harder to prove her worth, even if her talent spoke for itself. Mr. Carter stood at the front, scanning over the class. He had a friendly smile on his face, but something about the way he adjusted his glasses made Amara uneasy. He looked around the room and stopped on her for a brief moment. Just a flicker of his eyes before he turned back to the class. "All right, let's get started," he said, his voice smooth and confident. "I'm sure some of you have already signed up for the talent show. I want each of you to think about what you'll perform, but remember, the key to being a great musician isn't just technique, it's about passion." He turned to the blackboard, starting to write down a list of things to consider for their upcoming performance, but his words hung in the air, a little too casually dismissive. "I'm expecting to hear some classical, some jazz maybe," he added, his eyes scanning the room again. "But we'll see how it goes." Amara felt a slight discomfort in his tone. She tried not to let it show, but her hands clenched under the desk. Jazz, classical, it seemed like a harmless comment, but she knew how Mr. Carter's type thought. The unspoken assumption was clear: people like her, black girls, in particular, probably weren't going to bring anything other than what they thought was expected. The stereotype music, jazz, rhythm and blues, things that didn't require any real technical depth. But Amara wasn't like that. Her family's history in music ran deeper than just jazz. Her mom had sung in choirs and her grandmother had been a renowned pianist who played in classical concert halls. She could do classical music with the same precision as anyone. She had the chops for it. Still, it wasn't like she was going to announce her plans to everyone right away. That wasn't her style. She wasn't here to compete for attention, she just wanted to play. And this year's talent show would give her the perfect opportunity to prove that. But for now, she sat still, absorbing the tension that ran like static through the air. It was a familiar feeling, one she had gotten used to over the years. Being the only black girl in this class meant she had to work twice as hard to earn the respect that came easily to others. She wasn't going to let it stop her. Not this time. "Amara, you still with us?" Mr. Carter's voice broke through her thoughts, and her heart skipped a beat. She looked up, trying to disguise the sudden rush of embarrassment. Yeah, Mr. Carter," she replied softly, her voice betraying her nerves. "Just thinking about the show." He raised an eyebrow, a slight smirk tugging at his lips. "I'm sure you'll do just fine. But make sure you pick something challenging. No one wants to hear the same thing over and over again." He said it casually, but there was something in his tone that struck Amara like a hidden jab. He was probably expecting her to choose something safe, something stereotypical. The class seemed to go on in a blur after that. Amara felt the weight of Mr. Carter's expectations hanging over her. His judgment stung, but there was also a quiet fire building within her. How dare he assume she couldn't bring something fresh and new to the table? She had worked her whole life to be a pianist who could move between genres with ease. She wasn't going to let his assumptions stop her. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the period, Amara packed up her things slowly. She couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Carter had already decided what she was capable of, without ever hearing her play a single note. It wasn't fair, but it wasn't new either. She stood and walked toward the door, but before she could leave, Mr. Carter called out, his voice just a little too casual. "Amara, remember to bring me your song choice for the talent show by tomorrow. Don't pick anything too easy." She turned back, offering a tight smile. "Of course, Mr. Carter," she said, though inside, her mind was already working. He had no idea what he was about to witness. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? In the hallway, Amara paused, taking a deep breath. She had a plan now. She would show Mr. Carter exactly what she was capable of. No one, not him, nor anyone else, would ever underestimate her again. Amara's fingers drummed on the steering wheel as her mom drove them home, the familiar streets of the neighborhood rolling by in a blur. The radio was on softly in the background, playing a smooth jazz tune that Amara's mother, Naomi, would often hum along to. Amara's eyes lingered on the passing trees, their bare branches swaying in the crisp autumn breeze. But her thoughts were elsewhere, thinking about the class, the performance, and especially Mr. Carter. She remembered when her mother first introduced her to the world of music. She wasn't even 5 years old yet, and Naomi had sat her down at a baby grand piano, one that gleamed in the soft light of their living room. Amara had only touched the keys with curiosity, but her mother's gentle encouragement turned that curiosity into something more. It wasn't just about playing notes, it was about feeling the music. "Music speaks to you, Amara," Naomi would always say, her eyes sparkling with a wisdom that only comes from years of living and loving music. "It's not just the sound, it's the story you tell through it." As a child, Amara was enchanted. The music wasn't just a hobby, it was something that lived inside her, something deep and powerful. She'd play hours into the evening, her fingers skipping across the keys, her body swaying with the rhythm. Her mother had never pushed her to follow any specific path. Naomi herself had been a jazz singer, performing at small clubs in the city, her voice rich and soulful. But she'd never made it big, life had pulled her in different directions. Yet, Amara could see the fire in her mother's eyes every time she spoke about her passion for music. "You don't have to do what I did," Naomi often reminded Amara. "But I do hope you find your voice." Amara never questioned that she wanted to play music. It was in her bones. But as she grew older, things began to shift. When she started middle school, the students were different. The teachers, too. Being a black girl in a predominantly white school was always a challenge, especially when people assumed things about her before even knowing who she was. Her classmates were nice enough, but they rarely understood her. They didn't know about the jazz music her mother would play, or the late-night sessions her grandmother used to have on the piano, creating melodies that would stay with her forever. They didn't know about her family's rich musical history. At the same time, Amara was also starting to realize just how rare her talent was, especially in a place like this. Her classmates thought she was just another student who liked to play music for fun. They didn't see how much she poured into it. They didn't know how much she loved learning new techniques, diving into classical pieces and jazz improvisations with the same intensity. They only saw her as another black girl, often relegating her musicality to a stereotype. Jazz, hip-hop, or rhythm and blues, they expected that from her. But Amara knew there was so much more to her story. At home, things were different. Her grandmother, Lillian, a retired concert pianist, was the one who truly understood Amara's passion for the piano. Lillian had been a fixture in Amara's life, always teaching her how to play pieces from the great classical composers, Chopin, Mozart, Bach, and how to appreciate the intricacies of music. "Music is a bridge between your heart and the world," Lillian would say with a knowing smile, her voice smooth and comforting. "You've got to put all of yourself into it, your emotions, your soul, everything." Amara spent hours after school with her grandmother, practicing in the small living room of her grandmother's apartment, the old upright piano filling the room with deep, resonant tones. It was with Lillian that Amara began to understand the deep, classical side of music, the kind of music that made people listen in silence, captivated by the emotion and technique it required. Her grandmother was the first to introduce Amara to jazz. Jazz isn't just about improvising, sweetheart, Lillian had told her. It's about freedom. It's about breaking boundaries. But it's also about knowing the rules well enough to know when to break them. Amara had fallen in love with jazz, but she'd never stopped playing classical music either. To her, there was something poetic about the contrast between the two worlds. The discipline of classical music and the wild energy of jazz spoke to different parts of her. Sometimes, Amara felt like she was a blend of both, not fully fitting into either one. But the music gave her an outlet to express herself, to show people that she was more than their expectations. As she grew older, though, she started to realize that the world wasn't always so understanding. Her teachers were kind enough, but many of them didn't expect much from her beyond the basics. The musicians in her classes usually saw her as just another student playing a basic piece, someone who didn't have much to offer. And she noticed it. Teachers would ask her to perform pop songs, assuming she couldn't handle more difficult pieces, or they'd comment on her musical choices with a hint of surprise. But Amara wasn't someone who liked to back down from a challenge. As her mother's voice drifted through her thoughts on the drive home, Amara felt that familiar fire burning inside her. She could do this. She would show Mr. Carter that she wasn't just another stereotype to be boxed into one category. She had the skills, the passion, and the determination to play anything, to transcend any expectations. The car turned down their street, and Amara's mind settled into focus. Tomorrow, she would show Mr. Carter just how wrong he was about her. She wasn't going to settle for anything less than her best. When they pulled into the driveway, Naomi gave her daughter a knowing look. She could tell Amara was carrying something heavy, her thoughts swirling. "Everything okay?" Naomi asked, her voice warm. Amara nodded, offering a half smile. "Yeah, just thinking about my performance for the talent show. I think I've got something in mind." Her mother raised an eyebrow. "Something big?" "Something big," Amara replied confidently. And deep down, she knew she meant it. The next day in class, Amara couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the way Mr. Carter had looked at her, nor was it the subtle way he had dismissed her abilities the day before. It was the tension she could feel building, not just in her, but in the room around her. She had a sense that everyone was waiting for her to prove herself, and she could feel the weight of their expectations hanging in the air. As she entered the classroom, she noticed the subtle shift in atmosphere. The desks had been rearranged in a large circle, and in the center was a grand piano. Her eyes widened slightly. This was it. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, the chance to finally show what she could do. But she wasn't the only one who had a plan. As Amara took her seat, she noticed the others whispering excitedly among themselves, especially those who were always the loudest in class. They were discussing their song choices for the talent show, and the list was predictable: top 40 pop hits, a couple of modern rock songs, and a few tried-and-true classical pieces. Nothing stood out. Nothing that challenged expectations. Nothing that would make Mr. Carter sit up and pay attention. And then, just as Amara was about to pull out her notebook to jot down her own ideas, Mr. Carter spoke up. "All right, class, let's go over our choices," he said, flashing a smile that felt more practiced than genuine. "I want to make sure everyone's prepared for the talent show. This is a chance to show what you've got. I'll go around and hear what you plan to perform. No need to be shy." Amara's stomach churned. She wasn't shy, at least, not usually. But her mind raced. What if she picked the wrong piece? What if it wasn't challenging enough? What if it wasn't enough for him? Mr. Carter started with the students closest to him, casually asking them to share their song choices. Amara watched as they proudly named their pop hits, offering explanations that made the teacher smile and nod with approval. It seemed to go as expected. Everyone picked something safe, something easy to digest. The perfect kind of performance for someone like Mr. Carter. When it was Amara's turn, she straightened her shoulders and stood up. She had made up her mind. She was going to perform a piece that blended the elegance of classical music with the passion of jazz. A piece that had the technical depth to impress, yet the freedom to showcase her soul. A piece that would make her not just another student, but someone Mr. Carter would remember. She cleared her throat. "I'll be performing Rhapsody in Blue by George Gershwin," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's a jazz and classical fusion piece." The moment the words left her mouth, she could feel the room go quiet. The students' whispers ceased, and for a heartbeat, the entire class turned to look at her. Mr. Carter raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback. "Rhapsody in Blue?" he repeated, his tone questioning. "That's quite a choice, Amara." Amara nodded, holding her ground. "Yes. It's a challenging piece, but I think I can do it justice." There was a long pause. Mr. Carter's gaze lingered on her, his expression unreadable. "I see," he said finally, with a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "I just hope you're ready for it. It's a lot of work." Amara wanted to argue, to say something sharp about how he didn't know her, didn't know what she was capable of, but she swallowed the words. There was no point in proving herself through words anymore. It was time to show it through music. The rest of the class continued to make their song selections, but Amara couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in the air. Mr. Carter's words had stung, even if he had meant them to be encouraging. He hadn't seen her. He hadn't seen what she was capable of, nor had he considered that she might have something different to offer. She sat back down, hands clasped tightly in her lap, as the others made their selections. It wasn't long before the bell rang, signaling the end of class. The students filtered out, but Amara lingered a bit longer. Mr. Carter was packing up his notes at his desk when she stood up and walked over. "Mr. Carter," she began, trying to keep her voice calm, "I know Rhapsody in Blue is a big piece, but I'm ready for it. I'm serious about this." Mr. Carter looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "I'm sure you are, Amara. But remember, you don't want to bite off more than you can chew." Amara's heart skipped a beat at his dismissive tone. She could feel the challenge in his words, and for a moment, her mind flashed with all the times people had doubted her before. But there was something different this time. She wasn't going to back down. "I won't," she replied firmly, "but I do want you to know that I'm not like the others. I don't just play what's easy." She turned to leave, but Mr. Carter called out to her. "Good luck, Amara. I'm looking forward to hearing what you've got." But Amara didn't feel reassured. His words didn't hold the weight of encouragement, at least not in the way she had hoped. She could sense his doubt, and it fueled the fire inside her even more. He didn't know her, didn't understand her, and she wasn't going to let him make her feel small again. The rest of the day passed in a blur for Amara. She barely heard what her teacher said, or noticed what her friends were doing. All she could focus on was the piano, the music, the performance. And most of all, the moment when she would take the stage and show Mr. Carter just how wrong he was. The days leading up to the talent show were a blur of practice and preparation. Amara spent hours in her grandmother's small apartment, her fingers flying over the keys of the piano, each note an expression of her growing determination. The world outside her music was still there, school, friends, the constant pressure to fit into a mold, but in the sanctuary of the piano, nothing else mattered. The Rhapsody in Blue was a masterpiece, blending the sophistication of classical with the raw energy of jazz. Every time she played it, Amara felt the music pulse through her veins, urging her to push herself harder, to reach deeper into her soul. She had a plan. She knew exactly how she wanted to perform it, she would begin with the slow, lyrical opening, building into the jazzy middle section with all the freedom and excitement that Gershwin had intended. It would be the kind of performance that left people breathless, the kind that made them listen with every fiber of their being. But still, the doubt from Mr. Carter's voice haunted her. She knew he thought she couldn't handle it. She could feel it in the way he'd looked at her when she'd told him what she was performing. It wasn't just the words, but the unspoken ones, the way he had sized her up, as though he was waiting for her to fail. On the morning of the talent show, Amara woke up earlier than usual. The cold air outside made the day feel sharper, more alive. The nerves that had settled into her chest over the past few days were now in full force, but instead of allowing them to overwhelm her, she channeled them into focus. She was ready. Her mother, Naomi, was in the kitchen when Amara came downstairs. Naomi looked up, offering her daughter a warm smile. "You nervous?" Naomi asked, setting down a cup of tea. "A little," Amara admitted, pulling out a chair and sitting down. "But I know what I'm doing. I've been practicing for weeks." Naomi nodded, her face soft with understanding. "You're going to be amazing. I've seen you play that piece 100 times, and every time, it's like you're telling a story with every note. Just remember, this is your moment. No one else's." Amara smiled. Her mother's words were like a balm to the nerves that had been creeping in. It wasn't about Mr. Carter. It wasn't about anyone else. This was her moment to tell her story. The talent show was taking place in the school's auditorium, and as Amara walked into the room, her stomach twisted with excitement and anxiety. The atmosphere was alive with energy. Students were running around, adjusting microphones and instruments, chatting nervously. The air smelled faintly of popcorn and stage lights. She made her way to the back of the auditorium, where the performers were waiting their turn. She could already hear some of her classmates practicing in the wings, pop songs, rock ballads, even a few classical pieces. Nothing out of the ordinary. She felt a flicker of doubt, but she pushed it down quickly. This wasn't about what anyone else was doing. It was about her. "Amara, you're up next," the stage manager called, pulling her from her thoughts. Her heart thudded in her chest, but she stood up, her legs steady beneath her. She could do this. She would do this. When she stepped onto the stage, she immediately noticed Mr. Carter in the audience. He was sitting near the front, a notebook open in his lap, watching her intently. The pressure was on, but Amara only focused on the piano in front of her. The spotlight hit her, and the rest of the room faded away. It was just her and the music now. She sat down at the grand piano, taking a deep breath. Her fingers hovered over the keys, and for a moment, everything went still. She could feel the weight of her choice, the expectation hanging in the air. But then, she let her fingers fall onto the keys, and the opening of Rhapsody in Blue began to fill the space. The slow, mournful notes flowed first, a soft and lyrical melody that seemed to breathe through her. The room was silent, every ear tuned to the music. Amara closed her eyes for a moment, losing herself in the rhythm, letting the music take control. She could feel the eyes on her, but it didn't matter. She was telling her story. As the piece picked up tempo, shifting into the jazzy, syncopated section, Amara's hands moved with ease, her fingers gliding over the keys. The sound filled the auditorium with energy, the music taking on a life of its own. She could hear the faint gasps of surprise from the audience as she shifted effortlessly between the classical and jazz elements, creating a perfect fusion of the two. She wasn't just playing music. She was pouring herself into every note, showing them all who she truly was. Her eyes flickered briefly to the front row, and she caught Mr. Carter's gaze. His expression was unreadable, but Amara didn't care anymore. She was in the zone, the music flowing through her like a river that couldn't be stopped. The final crescendo of the piece approached, and Amara's heart raced in time with the music. She played with everything she had, every ounce of emotion and technique, pushing herself to the limit. And then, with a final flourish, the piece ended, silent for a heartbeat before the applause erupted. Amara sat at the piano, breathing heavily but smiling. She had done it. She had played the piece exactly how she envisioned it. It wasn't just the notes, it was the heart, the soul, the passion behind every keystroke. The applause was deafening, and for a moment, Amara allowed herself to bask in it. The validation, the recognition, it felt good. But it wasn't the applause that mattered to her. It was the music, the performance. She had proved something to herself. And that was enough. As she stood up from the piano, she saw Mr. Carter clapping along with the rest of the crowd, though there was something different in his eyes. She couldn't read it, but it didn't matter. The music had spoken for her. The rest of the world would just have to catch up. Amara stepped off the stage, her heart still pounding in her chest. The applause echoed in her ears, but it wasn't the cheers that gave her a sense of accomplishment. It was the fact that she had finally done it, she had played the piece with everything she had, and it had resonated with the audience. She had stood up for herself, for her talent, for her passion. And that, more than anything, was the victory. But as she made her way back to the wings, a new wave of nerves crashed over her. She was still processing the performance, still riding the adrenaline high, but she couldn't ignore the flutter of anxiety in her stomach. How had Mr. Carter reacted? Her eyes scanned the auditorium, landing on the front row. There, among the other students, sat Mr. Carter. His arms were crossed, and he was looking at her intently, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, Amara felt her confidence falter. Was he still disappointed? Had she disappointed him? Before she could dwell on those thoughts any longer, a voice pulled her from her reverie. Amara! You were amazing. It was Tasha, one of her best friends from school, her face lit up with excitement. That was unbelievable. Seriously, I didn't know you could do that. Amara smiled, but the words felt hollow for a second. Thanks, Tasha. I just wanted to show everyone what I can do. Tasha gave her a knowing smile. You didn't just show them. You wowed them. I mean, the whole auditorium was buzzing after your performance. You're going to win this thing, no doubt. Amara appreciated her friend's enthusiasm, but in the back of her mind, one thought kept circling, Mr. Carter's gaze. She couldn't shake it. It wasn't until later, when the talent show was nearly over, that Amara found herself standing alone in the hallway outside the auditorium. The sounds of the event still echoed inside, but the building felt quieter now, more still. She needed a moment to collect her thoughts. That's when she heard footsteps behind her. Amara. It was Mr. Carter. His voice was soft but commanding, drawing her attention. Can we talk for a minute? Amara turned to face him, her stomach dropping. She hadn't been expecting this, hadn't expected him to seek her out. Sure, she replied, trying to steady her breath. What's up? Mr. Carter stood in front of her, looking less like a teacher and more like someone trying to find the right words. He was quiet for a moment before speaking again. You know, he began, I wasn't sure what to expect when you picked Rhapsody in Blue. I'm not going to lie. It's a difficult piece, and I was concerned it might be too much. He paused, clearly searching for the right words. But I was wrong. Amara blinked, her heart skipping a beat. You, what? Mr. Carter nodded. You played that piece with a level of skill and feeling I wasn't expecting. I didn't give you enough credit, Amara. I underestimated you. The words hit her like a wave. For a moment, she couldn't speak. She had spent so much time battling the idea that he didn't believe in her, that she had almost convinced herself she wasn't good enough. But here he was, admitting he had been wrong. He was acknowledging her talent, not just as a student, but as a musician. I knew you had potential, he continued, but what you did up there, it was beyond that. You didn't just play the notes, you felt them. You made the music yours. Amara's eyes burned, and for a second, she struggled to keep the tears at bay. She had worked so hard for this moment, and hearing Mr. Carter say these words felt like a validation of everything she had sacrificed. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "That means a lot." Mr. Carter gave her a small smile, his expression softening. "You earned it, Amara. I'm sorry for doubting you. You proved me wrong." She nodded, her mind spinning. There was so much she wanted to say, so much she had felt in the past few weeks, but for now, this moment was enough. She didn't need to hold on to the doubts and fears anymore. She had done what she set out to do, she had shown him, and everyone else, exactly who she was. "I'm glad I could show you," Amara said, her voice steady now. "I just needed the chance." "You've definitely got it," Mr. Carter said, his voice sincere. "And I'll be the first to tell anyone who asks just how wrong I was about you. You've got a future in this, Amara. I don't know where it'll take you, but I know you're going places." The weight of his words hit her in a way she hadn't expected. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sense of accomplishment that had little to do with the performance and everything to do with the journey she had taken to get there. This wasn't just about winning the talent show. This was about standing up for herself, for her art, and for the belief that she deserved to be heard. As Mr. Carter walked away, Amara stood in the hallway for a moment longer, letting the truth of what he had said sink in. She had done it. She had proved to herself, and to him, that she wasn't just the girl with the potential. She was the girl who could do more than anyone ever imagined. She was ready for the next step. The days following the talent show passed by in a blur. Amara couldn't help but replay the performance over and over in her mind. It had been everything she'd hoped for, and more. The moment she'd walked off the stage and seen the smiles on her friends' faces, the excitement in their eyes, it had felt like she had finally been recognized for who she truly was. Not just as the quiet, underestimated student, but as someone capable of greatness. Despite the excitement, the validation wasn't the end of her journey. The applause was over, the talent show was behind her, and now she had to face the reality of what came next. For Amara, that meant continuing her path toward her dreams, even when it felt like the world still had expectations that didn't quite match who she was. Mr. Carter's words still echoed in her mind. His acknowledgement meant more to her than she realized. When he had apologized for doubting her, it wasn't just about him realizing he was wrong. It was about the feeling of finally being seen for her talent, not just for what people assumed her limits were. For years, she had carried the weight of others' low expectations. People had doubted her, or worse, simply overlooked her, because she didn't fit their idea of what success looked like. But the talent show had changed that. She had proved to herself that she didn't need anyone else's validation to believe in her ability. She could achieve her dreams on her own terms. It was a chilly Thursday afternoon when Amara decided to have a heart-to-heart with her mom, Naomi, about everything that had happened. They were sitting at the small kitchen table, where Amara was working through some music theory homework, but her mind kept drifting back to the performance. "Mom, I don't think I've told you enough how much your support meant to me through all of this," Amara said, pushing her homework aside and looking up at her mother. Naomi paused, wiping her hands on a dish towel before sitting down beside her. She smiled softly, her eyes filled with warmth and pride. "I've always believed in you, Amara. I'm just glad you're starting to believe in yourself too." Amara sighed, her chest tightening slightly as she reflected on her journey. "It's not easy, you know. Sometimes I feel like I'm constantly proving myself, like I have to show everyone that I'm not just a stereotype, that I can be more than they think. Like when Mr. Carter didn't believe in me at first, it stung. But when he finally admitted he was wrong, it felt like a weight had been lifted." Her mom nodded, her gaze soft but knowing. "It's tough, sweetie. People will always try to put you in a box, or think they know what you're capable of. But remember, the only limits you have are the ones you place on yourself. Your talent, your passion, is something no one can take away from you. Don't let anyone's doubts shape how you see yourself. Amara sat back in her chair, letting her mom's words sink in. For so long, she had let others' expectations define her, but now, she was beginning to see that she could rewrite her own story. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong, it was about proving to herself that she could do anything she set her mind to. The more Amara thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just a turning point in her musical journey. It was a turning point in her life. She was starting to understand the power of self-belief. No matter what obstacles came her way, no matter how many times people underestimated her, she had the ability to rise above it. Her talent wasn't something she had to prove to anyone else, it was something she had to nurture, cultivate, and share with the world. The real challenge now was not about changing others' perceptions, but about continuing to grow and evolve, regardless of who believed in her or not. The next few months were a whirlwind of opportunities and setbacks. Amara continued to practice daily, pushing herself to learn new pieces, explore new genres, and refine her skills. She joined a jazz ensemble at school and performed in local recitals, her confidence growing with each new performance. But it wasn't just about the music anymore. It was about the person she was becoming, the one who didn't shrink in the face of doubt, who faced challenges with courage, and who had a story to tell through every note she played. Amara's relationship with Mr. Carter shifted, too. While he had been a figure of authority in her life, one who initially dismissed her abilities, he gradually became a mentor. He started to recognize her potential, not just as a pianist, but as an artist with a unique voice. He encouraged her to apply to a prestigious summer music program, something she'd never even considered for herself. And, to her surprise, he recommended her for a scholarship. The scholarship application was long and rigorous, but Amara threw herself into it, pouring her heart and soul into her essay, her resume, and her performance piece. She worked late into the nights, just like she had when she first learned Rhapsody in Blue. She wasn't doing it for anyone else. She was doing it for herself. And when the acceptance letter came, weeks later, on a sunny morning, Amara couldn't contain her tears. The email subject line read, "Congratulations, you've been selected for the summer jazz program." She ran to find her mother, her heart racing. "Mom! I did it. I got in." Naomi embraced her daughter tightly. "I knew you would, Amara. I knew it from the start." Amara smiled through her tears. She had earned this. She had worked for it. And she had proven that no one, not even the people who doubted her, could define what she was capable of. That summer, she spent her days surrounded by some of the most talented musicians she had ever met. The program was rigorous, pushing her to explore new techniques and styles, but it also gave her a sense of belonging. She no longer felt like the outsider, the girl with something to prove. She was among peers who understood her passion, her drive, and her voice. And when she returned home after the program, Amara knew she was ready for the next challenge. The journey was just beginning, and she was no longer afraid to take it on. The summer had come and gone, and Amara returned home with more than just a certificate of completion from the prestigious summer jazz program. She had returned with a renewed sense of purpose. The experiences she'd had there had shaped her in ways she hadn't even anticipated. Surrounded by talented musicians who came from different walks of life, she had found a community of people who understood her struggles and shared her ambitions. They weren't just fellow musicians, they were her comrades, her partners in the pursuit of something bigger than any one of them could achieve alone. As Amara sat in her bedroom, her hands instinctively reached for her piano. It had always been her safe space, the place where she could express everything she couldn't put into words. But now, with the summer program behind her and the excitement of her new experiences still fresh, the piano felt different. The music felt more alive, more urgent. Her fingers brushed over the keys, a new sense of freedom in her touch. The lessons she'd learned from the program didn't just apply to music. She had discovered the power of community, the importance of collaboration, and most importantly, the value of perseverance. But there was still one thing on her mind, the next step. What would she do with everything she'd learned? One afternoon, a few weeks after returning home, Amara found herself sitting at the kitchen table once more, her mother beside her. The conversation had shifted from mundane topics like school to something more serious. Amara had been thinking a lot about her future, about her goals, and what she wanted to do with her music. "I'm thinking about applying to a conservatory," Amara said, her voice steady but filled with anticipation. "I want to take the next step, and I think that's where I need to go." Naomi set down her cup of tea and looked at her daughter with pride. "That's a big step, sweetie. But I've seen how hard you've worked. You're ready for it." Amara nodded, the weight of her decision settling on her shoulders. "I know it's going to be difficult. There's a lot of competition out there. But I'm ready to give it my all." Her mother's eyes softened. "You've already proven to yourself that you can do anything. No matter what happens, I know you'll find a way to make your dreams come true." The conversation lingered in Amara's mind for the next few days. She spent hours researching conservatories, looking into programs that would not only challenge her musically but also nurture her growth as an artist. It wasn't going to be easy, nothing worth doing ever was, but she knew it was the right path for her. As the months passed and her application deadlines approached, Amara's commitment to her craft grew even stronger. Her piano practice became even more focused, with her technique improving as she explored new compositions and jazz improvisation. Every day was a new opportunity to push herself, to take one step closer to her dream. But as with all journeys, there were moments of doubt. Sometimes, late at night, Amara would lie awake, questioning whether she was truly good enough. Despite the confidence she had gained, there were still moments when imposter syndrome crept in, when she felt like she was pretending to be something she wasn't. What if she wasn't truly talented? What if the conservatories didn't see her potential? She found herself back at the piano, seeking comfort in the familiar sound of the keys beneath her fingers. It was in those moments of uncertainty that Amara realized something important: the doubt, the fear, the challenges, they were all part of the process. Every musician, every artist, faced them at some point. The key wasn't to eliminate those feelings, but to acknowledge them and continue moving forward despite them. She had learned that from the summer program, from Mr. Carter, and from her own journey. As the application deadlines loomed closer, Amara sent in her materials, her essay, her resume, and her audition video, feeling a mix of nerves and excitement. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she was truly at peace with her path. Days turned into weeks, and soon, the acceptance letters began to arrive. Some were for programs she had expected, others for schools she hadn't even considered. Amara opened each letter with trembling hands, but with every rejection, she didn't feel the crushing weight of disappointment she had once feared. She had learned to embrace failure, understanding that it wasn't the end, it was simply a part of the journey. And then, one afternoon, she found an envelope with the return address of one of the conservatories she had applied to. It was the one that had felt like the perfect fit, the place where she could truly grow as a musician. Her heart raced as she tore open the envelope, scanning the letter quickly. "Dear Amara, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted into the classical and jazz program at our conservatory. We were thoroughly impressed by your audition, your dedication, and your unique voice as an artist. We look forward to seeing you grow and thrive in our community. Sincerely, Admissions Committee." Amara let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. She had done it. She had made it. The weight of everything she had worked for over the past few years, the countless hours of practice, the doubts she had silenced, the fears she had faced, had finally paid off. She sat in her room, staring at the letter, a mix of joy, disbelief, and overwhelming gratitude flooding her heart. She had proved something to herself, and in doing so, had opened the door to a future she had always dreamed of. Later that evening, Amara sat down with her mother, the two of them sharing a quiet, reflective moment. "I did it, Mom," Amara said softly, the weight of the moment sinking in. "I got in." Naomi smiled, her eyes glistening with pride. "I knew you would. This is just the beginning, Amara. You've only scratched the surface of your potential. The world is yours to take." Amara nodded, feeling the truth of her mother's words in her bones. She had come a long way from the quiet girl who had been underestimated and overlooked. She had fought for her place in the world, and now, as she prepared to embark on the next chapter of her journey, she knew that the sky was the limit. The road ahead would not be easy, but she was ready for it. With every note she played, every step she took, she was carving out a future all her own. And this was just the beginning. The beginning of a new chapter in Amara's life was quickly approaching. The day she received her acceptance letter felt like a distant memory now, buried beneath the weight of all the preparations for the move. Packing up her room, her life, and her piano was a strange mix of excitement and sadness. She was leaving behind everything she knew, her friends, her family, the comforting familiarity of home. But she was also stepping into something much bigger, a future full of possibilities. Amara had spent the past few weeks feeling a whirlwind of emotions, nervousness, anticipation, and excitement. She was preparing to attend one of the most prestigious conservatories in the country. A part of her couldn't believe it. After everything she had been through, after all the people who doubted her, she was now on the verge of something extraordinary. But as the days ticked down, and the move-in date grew closer, her thoughts began to turn to the things she would miss the most. The comfort of her mom's voice calling her from the kitchen, the laughter of her friends during lunch breaks at school, the quiet evenings at home, where the only sound was the gentle tapping of her fingers on the piano keys. She would miss it all, even though she knew this was a step she had to take. "Mom, I'm going to miss you so much," Amara said, as they packed the last of her clothes into the car. They were standing in the driveway, the trunk of the car filled to the brim with bags and boxes. Naomi smiled softly, a bittersweet expression on her face. "You're going to do great, Amara," Naomi said, her voice filled with confidence. "I'm proud of you. And I'm not going anywhere. You're just a phone call away, remember?" Amara nodded, but there was a lump in her throat that made it hard to speak. Her mom had always been there for her, through the doubts, the struggles, and the triumphs. This was the first time Amara would be stepping out on her own, away from everything that had kept her grounded. It was a scary thought, but also an exciting one. With one last hug, Amara climbed into the car, and they began the long drive to the conservatory. Her thoughts were a mixture of excitement and nervousness, her heart racing at the thought of what lay ahead. What would it be like? Would she fit in? Was she good enough to be there? As the car got closer to the campus, Amara's nervousness only increased. The conservatory was located in a bustling city, far away from the quiet suburban town she had grown up in. It was a world of its own, a place where the best musicians from around the country gathered to perfect their craft. She could already feel the weight of expectations hanging over her, but she tried to push the thought aside. This was her time. She had worked for this, and she belonged here. When they arrived, the campus was even more impressive than Amara had imagined. Tall, modern buildings with grand archways lined the streets, and everywhere she looked, she saw students walking around with instruments in hand, deep in conversation, or lost in thought as they prepared for the next rehearsal or class. The energy of the place was palpable. There was an excitement, a drive, a hunger for success. Amara and her mom walked through the main entrance, and a guide directed them to her dormitory. She felt a mixture of awe and intimidation, but at the same time, something inside of her sparked. This was where she was supposed to be. This was the next step in her journey. Once they reached her room, Amara looked around at the sparse walls and the simple furnishings. It was a far cry from the comfort of her room at home, but it would do. She put her bags down, her gaze drifting toward the piano that stood in the corner. She had made sure to bring a small keyboard with her. There was no way she could go without practicing, even in this unfamiliar place. Her mom helped her settle in, unpacking a few of her things and arranging them around the room. But before long, the time came to say goodbye. Naomi hugged her daughter tightly, her words filled with emotion. "Remember, Amara, this is just the beginning," she said. "You've worked so hard to get here. Don't ever forget that. And don't ever stop believing in yourself." Amara nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I won't. I promise." As Naomi left, Amara stood by the window, watching her mother's car disappear into the distance. It was official. She was on her own now. The first few days at the conservatory were a blur. There were orientations, meetings, and introductions to new professors and classmates. Everything was new and unfamiliar, and there was so much to take in. Amara felt overwhelmed at times, but she tried to stay focused. This was where she needed to be, and she wasn't going to let anything stop her. Her first class was a jazz theory seminar. As she walked into the classroom, she noticed the students around her. They all seemed so confident, so self-assured. It was intimidating. They were already talking about the things she had just started to grasp in the summer program, discussing advanced techniques and theories. Amara felt a wave of doubt wash over her. What if she wasn't as good as they were? What if she didn't belong here? But then she remembered the lessons she had learned in the past few years. She wasn't here to compare herself to anyone else. She was here to grow, to push her boundaries, and to discover new things about herself as a musician. She had earned her place in this room. As the professor began speaking, Amara focused on the music, the theory, and the people around her. She had made it this far, and now she had to continue believing in herself. Later that evening, after her first full day of classes, Amara sat down at the piano in her room. The music filled the space, her fingers moving over the keys with ease. She had a long road ahead of her, and there were going to be challenges, there always were, but this time, she felt ready. Her journey was just beginning, and she was determined to make the most of it. No matter what obstacles came her way, she knew that she had the strength to face them. And with that thought, Amara knew she was on the right path. The first few weeks at the conservatory were a whirlwind. Amara was quickly learning that the world of elite musicianship was more demanding than anything she had ever encountered. She had always been a dedicated student, but the rigorous pace at the conservatory challenged her in ways she hadn't imagined. Every day was a new hurdle, a new opportunity to prove herself. Each class was intense. Her professors pushed her harder than ever before, expecting not only technical precision but also creativity, expression, and a deep understanding of the music. Amara had always loved playing the piano, but now, every note, every chord, every subtle change in dynamics carried a weight she hadn't felt before. One of her most challenging classes was with Professor Fitzgerald, a renowned jazz pianist who was known for his perfectionism and sharp critiques. He didn't hold back when it came to pushing his students to their limits, and Amara soon learned that his lessons weren't for the faint of heart. On one particular day, during a class about improvisation, Amara found herself struggling. She had always been good at playing by ear, but improvisation was something new for her. Her fingers stumbled on the keys, the flow of the music stilted and uncertain. She tried to mask her hesitation, but Professor Fitzgerald noticed immediately. "Amara," he said, his voice cutting through the noise of the room, "you're holding back. You're too afraid to make a mistake. That's not how we play jazz." Amara's face flushed with embarrassment. She had always been cautious, always second-guessed herself. In that moment, she could feel her fear creeping in again. The fear of failing. The fear of not being good enough. "Jazz is about freedom," Professor Fitzgerald continued, his tone softer but still firm. "It's about embracing the imperfections and making them part of the music. You've got to let go and trust yourself." Amara nodded, trying to absorb his words. She had always been taught to be perfect, to play the notes exactly as they were written. But jazz was different. It required something raw, something unrefined, something that came from deep within. That night, she sat at her keyboard, determined to push through her fears. She closed her eyes and let her fingers fall on the keys, this time with no plan, no script. She didn't try to play the right notes or follow the rules, she just let the music come. It wasn't perfect, but it felt real. It felt like a step forward. The next day in class, Amara was nervous. She had never been one to take risks, but she knew she had to try again. When her turn came to improvise, she closed her eyes and let go. The notes flowed more freely this time. There were still mistakes, but they felt less like failures and more like opportunities to explore new ideas. Professor Fitzgerald listened intently, then gave her a small nod of approval. That's more like it. Keep pushing. The mistakes you're afraid of are the ones that will make you great. Amara felt a surge of pride. She was learning to trust herself, to let go of the fear that had held her back for so long. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. As the weeks went on, Amara began to find her rhythm at the conservatory. She spent hours practicing every day, refining her technique and pushing herself further. But it wasn't just about technical skill anymore, it was about finding her own voice as a musician. She started to see jazz not just as a set of rules to follow but as a language, one she could speak with her heart, her soul. However, not everything was smooth sailing. There were moments of doubt, moments when Amara questioned whether she was truly cut out for this world. One evening, as she sat alone in her room, she found herself staring at the piano, the weight of the pressure settling on her shoulders. Amara, she whispered to herself, are you really cut out for this? Maybe they were right. Maybe I don't belong here. The fear crept in again, the same fear she had experienced when she was first underestimated in high school, the fear of not being good enough. It was hard to ignore, harder still to silence. But just as she was about to give in to that feeling of uncertainty, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Olivia, one of her friends from the summer jazz program. Hey, how's everything going at the conservatory? The message read. I know it's tough, but you've got this. You're going to make it. Just remember why you started playing in the first place. Amara smiled, the warmth of Olivia's words washing over her. She took a deep breath and reminded herself that she wasn't alone in this. There were people who believed in her. She wasn't just trying to prove something to herself, she was proving that people who had underestimated her were wrong. The next day in class, Amara walked in with a new resolve. She might not have it all figured out, but she was going to keep pushing. When her turn came to improvise again, she didn't hesitate. She played with passion, with confidence, and with the understanding that even if she made mistakes, she was still learning, still growing. As the days passed, Amara became more comfortable with her own voice. She wasn't trying to be anyone else anymore, she was Amara, a young woman with a unique sound, and that was enough. She wasn't trying to be perfect, she was trying to be true to herself. One evening, after a particularly challenging rehearsal, Amara found herself walking across the campus to clear her head. The sky was a deep shade of purple, the stars starting to appear above her. It was quiet, peaceful, and for a moment, she could almost forget the pressure of her studies, the long hours of practice, the uncertainty of her future. As she walked, she thought about everything she had learned since arriving at the conservatory. The challenges, the doubts, the fears, all of it had pushed her to grow. She had come a long way from the girl who was afraid of taking risks. Now, she was ready to face whatever came next. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, Amara felt ready to take it on. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to meet them head-on. She was no longer the girl who had been underestimated, she was a musician, a force to be reckoned with. As the weeks passed, Amara continued to settle into her new life at the conservatory. The initial shock of the rigorous curriculum had worn off, and she found herself becoming more comfortable with the fast pace and the demands of her professors. Yet, with every passing day, she faced new challenges, ones that made her question her abilities and push the boundaries of her talent. One afternoon, as she walked to her afternoon seminar, a familiar name flashed on the bulletin board in front of her. It was a notice about an upcoming performance showcase, a big event where students were invited to showcase their talents for a panel of industry professionals, professors, and an audience filled with fellow musicians and students. Amara's heart skipped a beat as she read the flyer. It was an opportunity she had been dreaming of since the moment she stepped into the conservatory, but now that it was real, doubt began to creep in. Could she do it? Could she stand in front of an audience and perform without faltering, without second-guessing herself? She quickly tore her gaze away from the notice, as if the flyer itself was trying to tempt her into something she wasn't ready for. But the thought wouldn't leave her. It gnawed at her throughout the day, even as she sat in classes and rehearsals. That evening, after dinner, she stood before her piano, hands trembling slightly as she prepared to practice. She had played for years, but playing for a crowd was different. Performing in front of a panel of judges would bring a level of pressure she hadn't faced before. It wasn't just about playing the notes right, it was about connecting with the audience, sharing a part of herself with them. She placed her hands on the keys, closed her eyes, and started to play. The notes filled the room, a soft, gentle melody that seemed to calm her nerves. The music flowed effortlessly, and for a few minutes, she forgot about the upcoming performance. She was lost in the beauty of the sound, the familiarity of the music, the way the piano always felt like an extension of herself. But as soon as she stopped, the reality of the situation hit her again. Her fingers hovered over the keys, hesitation thick in the air. Could she really perform in front of an audience? Was she ready? A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was her roommate, Julia, who had quickly become a close friend since they'd met at the beginning of the semester. Julia had noticed Amara's quiet moments of doubt and had tried to encourage her whenever she could. "Hey, Amara, I heard about the performance showcase," Julia said with a grin. "Are you going to audition?" Amara hesitated, not sure how to answer. "I don't know," she admitted. "It feels like a big step. What if I mess up? What if I freeze up on stage?" Julia sat on Amara's bed, looking thoughtful. "Everyone has those fears. Even the best musicians. The thing is, you won't know what you're capable of until you take that step. The performance is a chance to show everyone who you are as an artist, not just your technical skill, but your heart, your soul. If you don't do it, you might always wonder what could have been." Amara met Julia's gaze, feeling a sense of comfort in her words. She had been so focused on the technical aspects of music, getting the notes right, staying in time, that she had forgotten the heart of it all. Music wasn't just about playing the right thing at the right time, it was about telling a story, sharing emotions, and connecting with others. "What if I fail?" Amara asked, her voice quieter now. Julia smiled. "Failure isn't the end. It's part of the journey. You won't know until you try." Amara took a deep breath, considering Julia's words. The fear of failure still lingered, but the desire to prove herself, to show everyone, including herself, that she was capable of more, began to outweigh that fear. She made up her mind. "I'll do it," Amara said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. "I'll audition." The day of the audition arrived faster than Amara expected. She had practiced for hours, refining every detail of her performance. But as she stood backstage, waiting for her turn, the nerves began to set in. Her stomach felt tight, and her palms were sweating. It was hard to focus on anything except the dread of performing in front of so many people. She glanced around the backstage area and saw other students, some pacing nervously, others sitting quietly, trying to calm their racing hearts. They were all in the same boat, facing the same fears. Then, her name was called. Amara's heart raced as she stepped out onto the stage. The spotlight hit her, blinding her momentarily, but she took a deep breath and sat at the piano. She could hear the faint murmur of the audience, their voices hushed in anticipation. For a moment, the room felt like it was spinning, the pressure almost suffocating. But then, she closed her eyes. The familiar feeling of the piano beneath her fingers grounded her, and she let the music take over. The first note was tentative, but soon, the melody began to flow, and Amara felt her nerves begin to settle. She was no longer focused on the audience, on the judges, or even on the potential mistakes she might make. She was lost in the music. The song she chose was a piece that held deep meaning for her, one that she had written herself during a particularly difficult time in her life. It was a song about overcoming obstacles, about finding hope in the darkest of times. The piece started slow, building in intensity as the music swelled. It was full of raw emotion, and Amara let it all pour out, every note, every pause, every shift in dynamics. She wasn't just playing the piano, she was telling a story. As she finished, the silence in the room felt deafening. For a moment, she was unsure whether she had made an impression, whether her performance had even been any good. But then, slowly, the audience erupted into applause. The sound was overwhelming, and Amara felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had done it. She had taken the risk and faced her fears, and in that moment, she knew it was all worth it. She stood up, bowing slightly, the rush of emotions surging through her. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about being real, about sharing a piece of herself with the world. And for the first time, she felt like she truly belonged. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. Amara took a big step in performing her own music. What's something you've always wanted to do, but fear has held you back? Share your thoughts in the comments. The applause from the performance lingered in Amara's ears long after the event had ended. As she walked off stage, the weight that had been pressing on her chest seemed to lift. She had done it. She had overcome the fear of judgment, the fear of failure. Her heart still raced, but this time, it was from the thrill of the experience, not anxiety. The feeling of accomplishment was intoxicating. It was as if, for the first time in her life, she had truly found her voice. The following days were filled with a newfound sense of confidence. Her classmates, many of whom had been watching the performance, now greeted her with smiles and nods of approval. There was a new respect in their eyes, one that Amara had longed for since she arrived at the conservatory. But it wasn't just the respect of her peers that mattered, it was her own respect for herself. She noticed the difference when she sat down at the piano to practice. It no longer felt like a chore, nor did she feel the constant pressure to be perfect. Instead, it felt like a conversation, a dialogue between her heart and the keys. The music came more freely now, not bound by the fear of failure but shaped by the joy of creation. She was making progress, not just as a musician, but as a person. Her instructors began to notice the shift in her too. Professor Fitzgerald, whom she had once feared, now looked at her with approval in every class. He no longer pushed her to the edge of exhaustion with criticism. Instead, he challenged her in ways that helped her grow. He even praised her for her performance, noting that her ability to communicate the emotional depth of a piece was something he didn't often see in students so young. "Keep playing from your heart, Amara," he told her one afternoon. "That's where the real magic happens." It was high praise coming from him, and it meant more to Amara than he would ever know. His words were a validation of everything she had been working toward. The fear of not being good enough still existed, but now it was met with the knowledge that she had something unique to offer, something that couldn't be measured by mere technical skill alone. But even as she basked in the glow of her recent success, there was still a part of her that couldn't shake the looming pressure. The conservatory was filled with some of the most talented musicians in the world, and Amara knew that the road ahead would be filled with more challenges. The performance was only the beginning. One day, as she sat at her desk, reviewing sheet music for an upcoming recital, she received a text from her mother. The message was short, but the words were a reminder of everything that had brought her to this point. "I'm so proud of you, Amara. Keep pushing. You've always been capable of great things. Amara smiled, her heart swelling with love. Her mother's words had always been a steady anchor in her life. They reminded her that even though the conservatory was a world apart from everything she had known, she wasn't alone in this journey. Her family was with her, supporting her from afar. It was moments like this, when the outside world faded away, that Amara realized just how far she had come. She was no longer the unsure, timid girl who had been afraid to take risks. She was becoming someone stronger, someone who understood that failure wasn't the end but a stepping stone. Her mother's message grounded her in the reality that she had the strength to keep going, even when the going got tough. As the weeks rolled on, Amara found herself becoming more immersed in the conservatory's community. She was invited to collaborate with other students on various projects, small performances, chamber music ensembles, and even some student-led jazz jams. She began to see how interconnected music was, how it was a conversation between artists. She was no longer just an individual musician striving for perfection, she was part of a creative network, one that thrived on collaboration, risk, and innovation. One day, while she was practicing a particularly challenging jazz piece, she received a message from Olivia. It was a voice memo, and Amara clicked play with curiosity. Amara. Olivia's voice bubbled with excitement. I just heard from the program director for the Summer Jazz Festival. They want to invite you to audition for a spot. They heard about your performance at the conservatory, and they think you have what it takes. Amara froze. She had heard of the Summer Jazz Festival before, an event that attracted musicians from around the world. It was the kind of opportunity she had only dreamed about, and now, it was within reach. But the fear crept in again. What if she wasn't good enough? What if she failed? But then, she thought back to the performance showcase, the moment she had decided to take a risk and put herself out there. She had survived that, and in doing so, she had grown. This was the next step, the next challenge, and she couldn't let fear hold her back. After a long moment, Amara typed a quick response to Olivia, I'm in. Let's do this. As she prepared for the Summer Jazz Festival audition, Amara found herself in a unique place. She was no longer the girl who had entered the conservatory unsure of herself, unsure of her place. She was stronger, more confident, and more willing to take risks. She had learned to trust the process, to embrace the ups and downs of her journey. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, Amara was ready to embrace whatever challenges came her way. The audition day arrived faster than she expected. The nerves were still there, but they were different now, tinged with excitement, not fear. As she walked into the audition room, she felt a sense of calm settle over her. She was prepared, she was confident, and most importantly, she knew that she was ready to give her all. Her fingers danced across the piano keys as she played her piece, each note an extension of herself, every chord infused with the passion she had learned to embrace. She wasn't just playing the notes. She was telling a story, and in that moment, she felt more alive than she ever had. As she finished, she took a deep breath and looked up at the panel of judges, their faces impassive but attentive. The silence felt like an eternity, but finally, the head judge spoke. Thank you, Amara. That was exceptional. The next few days felt like a blur. Amara had barely processed what had happened in the audition room before life surged forward at full speed. Her performance had been nothing short of electrifying, and when she had stepped out of the audition, her heart was still racing from the adrenaline. The feedback from the judges had been overwhelmingly positive, but even with that reassurance, she couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that there was more to prove. The pressure of the Summer Jazz Festival was different. It wasn't just an audition for another event, it was the event that could shape her future. This was her chance to be seen, to be heard on a stage with some of the best musicians from around the world. It had been a few days since her audition, and the waiting was driving her crazy. Her mind raced every time her phone buzzed, convinced that it was a notification about her fate. She had practiced every day, refining every note, every chord. But still, the thought lingered, what if they chose someone else? What if her performance, impressive as it had been, wasn't enough to secure a spot in the festival? Amara, I can practically see the wheels turning in your head, Olivia said, plopping down beside her in their shared practice room. Relax. Whatever happens, you've already done more than most people ever will. You've got this. Amara let out a breath, managing a half-smile. It's just, this could change everything. It's the kind of opportunity I've dreamed of since I first picked up the piano. I know. Olivia gave her a supportive pat on the back. And you've earned it. You're not just dreaming anymore. You're in the game. As the days passed, Amara tried to keep herself occupied, throwing herself into her practice. Still, the uncertainty hung over her like a dark cloud. It was a strange feeling, being on the cusp of something big, but not knowing whether it would turn into the success she'd hoped for. She often found herself recalling moments of doubt from earlier in her journey. Every time the pressure mounted, she would remind herself of the growth she'd experienced since her first days at the conservatory. If nothing else, she had proven to herself that she could handle whatever came her way. The day the email arrived, Amara was sitting at her piano, running through a difficult section of a new composition. When her phone pinged with a notification, her hands froze. She wiped her palms on her pants and hesitated before unlocking her phone. The subject line read, Summer Jazz Festival, Invitation to Perform. Her heart raced as she opened the message, each word appearing in slow motion as she read through the lines. There it was, the one sentence that made everything else fade into the background. We are thrilled to inform you that you have been selected to perform at the Summer Jazz Festival. Congratulations on your outstanding audition. A rush of emotions hit her all at once. She blinked, rereading the email to ensure she wasn't seeing things. But it was real. She had been selected. Yes. Amara screamed, jumping up from her seat, her heart pounding in excitement. She barely heard Olivia laughing as she burst into the room, having caught the tail end of Amara's jubilant outburst. You did it. Olivia grinned. I knew they'd choose you. I knew it. Amara couldn't help but laugh, her entire body vibrating with a mix of shock and pure joy. She had done it. She had earned a spot at the Summer Jazz Festival. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Amara's excitement had been tempered by the reality of what was to come. The festival was only a few weeks away, and there was no time to waste. She was no longer just practicing for the joy of music. Now, every moment spent at the piano was a critical piece of her preparation for the biggest performance of her life. She was no longer just playing for herself, she was playing for a crowd that would be watching her, judging her. Every day, she found herself at the practice rooms, running through the pieces she would perform, fine-tuning each note, making sure that nothing was left to chance. She had selected a blend of original compositions and jazz standards, songs that allowed her to showcase her technical skill as well as her emotional depth. These were pieces that meant something to her, songs that conveyed parts of her story. Professor Fitzgerald, though always stern, had been particularly supportive during this time. He offered his guidance on how to approach the performance, not just from a technical standpoint, but emotionally as well. Don't just play the notes, Amara. Live the music, he advised one afternoon. If you can make the audience feel what you're feeling, then you've won. And trust me, when you take that stage, they will feel it. His words echoed in her mind as she sat at the piano each day, her fingers moving with precision and grace. But every time she hit a wrong note or stumbled through a passage, her heart would race, filled with doubt. What if I freeze on stage? What if I'm not enough? Despite these moments of insecurity, Amara pushed forward. She reminded herself of everything she had gone through to get to this point, the doubts she had overcome, the courage she had summoned, the growth she had experienced. This was the culmination of all that hard work. She had earned her spot, and now it was time to show the world what she could do. One afternoon, as Amara was in the middle of practicing, she received another unexpected message from Olivia. This one was a video call. Amara hesitated before answering, but when Olivia's smiling face appeared on the screen, all the anxiety of the day seemed to melt away. "Hey, superstar," Olivia said, her voice full of excitement. "I heard the news. You're in. This is huge, Amara. You're going to absolutely kill it." Amara smiled, the weight of the moment sinking in. She felt the warmth of her friend's words, the support that had been unwavering from the beginning of her journey. "I still can't believe it's real," Amara admitted, her voice quieter now. "I've worked so hard for this moment, but I'm scared." Olivia's expression softened. "It's okay to be scared. It means you care. But remember, this is your moment. You've put in the work, and you're ready. Just trust yourself." As the festival drew nearer, Amara found herself surrounded by more and more opportunities to perform in front of others. Each small performance, whether it was in front of classmates or for faculty members, became an opportunity to refine her skills, build her confidence, and prepare for the ultimate challenge. She was no longer afraid of the stage. With every note she played, she could feel herself growing stronger. And by the time the Summer Jazz Festival arrived, Amara knew one thing for certain: she was ready. The day had finally arrived. The long days of practice, the constant questioning of whether she was truly ready, all led to this moment. Amara stood backstage at the Summer Jazz Festival, heart pounding in her chest, the distant hum of the crowd outside the performance hall vibrating through the walls. The festival was one of the biggest gatherings of jazz musicians in the world, and now, she was about to take the stage among them. For the past few weeks, the festival organizers had kept everything tightly scheduled, offering intensive workshops, jam sessions, and rehearsals. Amara had met so many talented musicians from different parts of the world, and every conversation, every jam session, had pushed her to grow. But now, the time had come for her to perform solo, and the pressure was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Amara stood by the stage entrance, her palms clammy with sweat. She could hear the chatter of the crowd, the rustle of programs being handed out, and the soft clinking of glasses from the bar area. It all seemed so surreal. Just a year ago, she was struggling to fit in at the conservatory, constantly doubting her place. And now, she was here, about to perform at one of the most prestigious jazz festivals in the world. The stakes were high, and the weight of that success felt almost too heavy to bear. "Hey," Olivia's voice cut through Amara's thoughts. She appeared at her side, her own eyes wide with excitement, her usual easy grin still firmly in place. "You ready?" Amara looked at her friend, seeing the same spark of excitement that had driven them both since they first met at the conservatory. Olivia had come along to support her, not just as a friend, but as someone who had seen her growth, her struggles, and her triumphs. "I don't know," Amara said, her voice shaky. "It's hard not to feel like I'm out of my depth here. Everyone's so talented. What if they don't like what I play?" Olivia gave her a reassuring smile, placing a hand on her shoulder. "They will, Amara. You've worked so hard for this, and that's what matters. Just remember who you are. You're the girl who took that stage at the conservatory and blew everyone away. Don't let this be any different." Amara took a deep breath, trying to shake the fear that had settled in her chest. She had put in the hours, the practice, the dedication. She had already proved something to herself. Now, it was time to show the world. The moment she walked out onto the stage, the noise of the crowd faded away. Her eyes adjusted to the soft lighting that illuminated the grand piano in front of her. For a split second, it felt like everything else had disappeared. It was just her and the music. The audience, a sea of faces, was silent, waiting in anticipation. The room was a mixture of jazz lovers, seasoned musicians, and festival goers, all eager to hear the next big thing in the jazz world. She took her seat at the piano, the familiar weight of the keys under her fingers grounding her in the moment. She felt the pressure, but she also felt something else, a quiet strength. This was what she had worked for. This was her time. With a deep breath, she started the first notes of her original composition, a soulful jazz piece that told a story of resilience and hope. The melody swirled in the air, rising and falling with each note, painting a picture of her journey. Her fingers danced across the keys, each movement filled with emotion. She poured everything she had into the performance, her passion, her fears, her dreams, and her struggles. Every note was an extension of herself, every chord a reflection of the strength she had found. As she continued to play, she became more immersed in the music, the rhythm flowing through her like a current. The audience's silent attentiveness began to shift into a palpable energy. She could feel their connection to the music, and it fueled her even more. She wasn't just playing for them, she was playing for herself, too. The final chords echoed through the hall, and as the last note hung in the air, Amara felt the weight of the moment settle over her. She had done it. She had shared a piece of herself with the world. The silence that followed was deafening. Amara held her breath, her heart racing. For what felt like an eternity, there was no sound, no applause, no cheers. Just a suffocating quiet. Then, the crowd erupted. It started as a few scattered claps, and then, almost as if the entire audience had been holding their breath too, the sound of applause built in waves until it was deafening. Amara's heart skipped a beat as the cheers and claps washed over her. Her hands trembled slightly as she stood, bowing to the audience. She could hardly believe it. They liked it. They really liked it. When she walked off the stage, her knees felt weak, but her smile was wide. Olivia was waiting for her backstage, practically bouncing with excitement. "You were amazing, Amara," Olivia exclaimed, throwing her arms around her friend. "I knew you'd nail it. You're incredible." Amara laughed, shaking her head. "I still can't believe it." "You should believe it," Olivia said, her voice filled with admiration. "You just proved it." The rest of the evening was a blur. Amara spent the night mingling with other musicians, exchanging stories, and sharing laughs. But through it all, one thing stuck with her, the feeling of belonging. For the first time, she didn't feel like an outsider. She was part of something bigger now, part of a community that valued not only skill but the emotion behind the music. And that, Amara realized, was the essence of jazz. As the night drew to a close, Amara sat alone for a moment in the quiet of the backstage area, looking out at the darkened streets beyond the venue. She thought about everything she had gone through to get here, the struggles, the doubts, the obstacles. And now, standing at the center of this incredible festival, she realized that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long, filled with challenges and opportunities, but she was ready. She had proven to herself what she was capable of. And from this moment on, she was no longer afraid to take the next step. The buzz of the festival still lingered in the air, but it was starting to settle as the days passed. Amara had played at the Summer Jazz Festival, and she had done what she had come to do, she had shared her talent with the world. Yet, as the applause faded and the excitement wore off, she found herself facing an unfamiliar feeling, uncertainty. For the first time in a long while, Amara was unsure about what came next. The thrill of the performance was still fresh in her memory, but with that came the daunting realization that this was not the end of her journey. The questions began to creep in. Was the festival just a moment of luck? Could she continue to rise, or had she peaked? "I guess that's it, huh?" Olivia said, breaking Amara's train of thought as they walked out of the venue after the final day of the festival. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows on the city streets. Amara sighed, glancing up at the skyline. "It feels like it should be, but I don't know. I thought I'd feel more accomplished, happy. But instead, I just feel lost." Olivia finished for her, giving her a sympathetic look. I get it. It's like you've climbed this huge mountain, but when you get to the top, there's a whole new peak you never saw before. It's kind of overwhelming. Amara smiled weakly. Yeah, that's exactly it. I don't know what to do now. I've done the thing I've always dreamed of, but I'm not sure it's enough. I don't even know what's next for me. Olivia walked beside her, quiet for a few moments. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer. Maybe it's time to stop worrying about what's next and just enjoy what you've done. You've earned this. You've earned everything that came with this festival, and I know you're going to keep going. But for now, just breathe. Celebrate this moment. For the first time in days, Amara took a deep breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Maybe Olivia was right. She had worked so hard, pushed herself so far, that the end of the festival felt like a milestone, but also like a weight, a reminder that there was always more to do. The pressure to keep climbing, to keep achieving, could sometimes overshadow the joy of the accomplishments already made. Back at the conservatory, the day after the festival, Amara found herself in an odd space. There were no more performances to rehearse for, no more workshops to attend. She was no longer in the hustle and bustle of the festival life, and she was struggling with the void that had been left behind. The halls of the conservatory seemed emptier, quieter. Amara sat in the practice room, staring at the piano in front of her. For weeks, she had been consumed by the festival and the preparation leading up to it. Now, there was no major event on the horizon. No one waiting for her performance. No immediate validation. She was alone with her thoughts again, and it was unsettling. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her reverie. She glanced at the screen, where she saw a message from Professor Fitzgerald. Amara, I'd like to speak with you after class today. It's about your performance at the festival. Her heart skipped a beat. Was this a good thing? Or was he going to tell her something she didn't want to hear? She had no idea, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of dread creeping up. Later that afternoon, after class, Amara found herself standing outside Professor Fitzgerald's office, her hand hovering over the door handle. She took a deep breath and knocked. The door creaked open, and she stepped inside. Come in, Amara, Professor Fitzgerald said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Please, sit. She did as he asked, her nerves settling just a little under his steady gaze. He was always calm, always composed, but this time, there was a sense of anticipation in the air. How are you feeling after the festival? He asked, folding his hands on the desk. Amara hesitated. Honestly? I don't know. I guess I thought I'd feel something different. Proud, maybe. But I keep wondering if it was enough. I keep thinking about what's next, but it all feels so uncertain. Professor Fitzgerald nodded, as though he understood exactly what she meant. I'm glad you're being honest. It's natural to feel that way. After a major achievement, we sometimes think that the next step should be even bigger, even more rewarding. But sometimes, the hardest part is realizing that it's okay to just be in the moment and savor what you've done. Amara thought about this for a moment. It was something she hadn't considered, her tendency to always look ahead, to push for more without taking time to appreciate the now. You were phenomenal at the festival, Amara, Professor Fitzgerald continued. Your performance was one of the best I've seen in a long time. But more than that, you've demonstrated something rare, growth. You've changed, and that's what matters. Amara looked at him, surprised. You think so? I do, he said with a small smile. You didn't just play the piano, you communicated through it. That's what separates a good musician from a great one. You found your voice, and that's not something anyone can teach you. Amara's heart swelled at his words. She had always admired Professor Fitzgerald's no-nonsense approach, but hearing his praise felt like the affirmation she needed. Maybe she didn't have to figure out everything at once. Maybe it was okay to sit with her achievements for a little while longer and let them sink in. As she walked out of the office, Amara felt a little lighter. The uncertainty was still there, lurking in the background, but it didn't feel as overwhelming anymore. She had done something extraordinary at the festival, and no matter what came next, that was hers to keep. Later that evening, Amara received a call from her mother. She couldn't wait to share the news. "Mom," she said, excitement bubbling in her voice. "You wouldn't believe it. I did it. I performed at the Summer Jazz Festival, and the audience, everyone, loved it." Her mother's voice crackled with joy over the phone. "I knew you could do it, sweetheart. You've always been special. Now, just remember, this is only the beginning. You've got so much more to offer." Amara smiled softly. Maybe she didn't have everything figured out, but for the first time in a long while, she felt okay with that. She had proven to herself what she was capable of. And in the end, that was enough. Amara's life had begun to settle back into a routine after the festival. She still practiced every day, although now it felt less like an obligation and more like an opportunity to explore her own voice. The weight of uncertainty that had hovered over her had lessened, but there was still that sense of restlessness beneath the surface. She knew she was capable of so much more, but the question remained, what was next? The conservatory was back in full swing, and for the first time in a while, Amara felt like she was just another student amidst the hustle and bustle. She found herself in class, learning theory, playing in ensembles, and engaging in the same academic structure that had always been part of her life. But there was a quiet hum of discontent, a yearning for something new. She loved her studies, but she also knew there was more out there waiting for her. One afternoon, as Amara sat in the practice room, her phone buzzed. She was midway through rehearsing a piece when she glanced down at the screen and saw a message from Professor Fitzgerald. "Amara, I have a new opportunity that I think would be perfect for you. Let's talk tomorrow after class. It's something that could really push you forward." Amara's heart skipped. A new opportunity? What could it be? She set her phone down and, despite her focus on the piano, couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The next day, Amara found herself once again in front of Professor Fitzgerald's office. She knocked and entered, this time with a little more confidence, eager to hear what he had to say. "Ah, Amara," he greeted her warmly. "Please, take a seat." Amara sat down, feeling both nervous and excited. "You mentioned an opportunity?" Professor Fitzgerald leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "Yes, I've been in contact with some colleagues at a music production company that specializes in contemporary jazz. They've seen your performance at the festival, and they're interested in bringing you on board to work on a collaborative project." Amara blinked in surprise. "A project? What kind of project?" He smiled. "They're looking for a young, fresh talent to contribute to an upcoming album they're producing, one that combines traditional jazz with elements of other genres, like electronic music and experimental sounds. They want someone with your creativity, someone who's not afraid to push boundaries." Amara's mind raced. This was the kind of opportunity she had been dreaming of. A chance to break out of the typical conservatory mold and do something different, something fresh and exciting. Wow, she stammered. "This is incredible. But, why me? What made them choose me?" Professor Fitzgerald shrugged slightly, his smile turning wry. "I told them about your performance. I think they saw the same spark that I did, the way you blend classical technique with your own sense of artistry. They're looking for someone who isn't afraid to experiment, someone who can take risks. You've shown them that you're more than just a technically proficient pianist, you're an artist." Amara felt a surge of pride. This was exactly the kind of validation she had been searching for, the kind that went beyond just playing the notes correctly. It was about creating something unique, something that came from within. How soon do they want to get started? She asked, her voice tinged with excitement. They're eager to begin, Professor Fitzgerald replied. They're looking to start the collaboration next month. You'd be flying out to New York to meet the team and get the ball rolling. Amara's heart raced at the thought. New York. The city where so many legends had walked the streets and played their music. She had always dreamed of performing there, but the idea of working on a professional project was something else entirely. I think I'm ready, she said, the words flowing from her lips before she could even fully process them. This is exactly what I've been waiting for. Professor Fitzgerald nodded. I think it's a great move for you. You've got the talent, the creativity, and now the chance to make a real impact. But remember, this is a big step. It won't be easy, but if anyone can do it, it's you. The rest of the week flew by in a whirlwind. Amara was on a high, her thoughts consumed by the upcoming project. She told Olivia about the opportunity, and her friend was beyond thrilled for her. You're going to kill it, Amara, Olivia said, her eyes wide with excitement. This is your chance to show the world what you can really do. New York, a collaboration with professionals. This is huge. Amara smiled at her friend's enthusiasm but felt a small pang of nervousness. She had always played for herself, for the pure love of music. But now, she was about to enter a world where expectations were high, and the stakes felt even higher. Could she handle it? Would she be able to live up to the hype? As the weeks passed, the details of the project began to fall into place. Amara received information about the artists she would be collaborating with, the songs she would be working on, and the team that would be guiding the process. It was a mix of excitement and nerves. She knew this could be her big break, but she also couldn't ignore the pressure. The night before her flight to New York, Amara found herself standing in front of the piano once again. She hadn't played much recently, caught up in the whirlwind of planning and anticipation. But now, as she ran her fingers over the keys, she allowed herself to feel the music again. There was a new sense of clarity in her playing. The fear, the uncertainty, it all seemed to fade as she lost herself in the music. For the first time in weeks, she was at peace. Whatever came next, she was ready. The next morning, Amara stood at the airport, her heart racing with excitement as she boarded the plane. New York was waiting. And with it, a future that was wide open, full of endless possibilities. The flight to New York felt surreal. Amara stared out the airplane window, watching the clouds drift by as the city skyline gradually came into view. The idea that she was about to work with a professional music production team was still hard to fully grasp. It had all happened so quickly. One moment she was uncertain and unsure of her next step, and now she was flying to the city that had shaped so many of the greatest musicians. Her heart was a mix of excitement and nerves. What if she wasn't good enough? What if she couldn't keep up with the professionals? But then she remembered the words Professor Fitzgerald had shared with her, "You've shown them that you're an artist." That was what kept her grounded. She wasn't just another musician. She was someone with something to say, someone whose music had the power to move people. And she was about to show the world exactly what that meant. Upon arriving in New York, Amara was swept up in the hustle of the city. The streets were alive with people and noise, the energy of the city almost palpable. She had only seen this place in movies and heard stories from famous musicians who had performed in its iconic venues, but now she was here, and it felt like stepping into a dream. Her first stop was the recording studio where she would be working. As she walked through the doors, she was immediately struck by how much larger and more sophisticated everything was than what she was used to. The room was filled with state-of-the-art equipment, microphones, and instruments she'd only ever seen in pictures or on YouTube. Amara, a tall, smiling woman with short, curly hair, greeted her as she entered the studio. "I'm Nina, the producer. It's so great to finally meet you in person. Welcome to the team." Amara smiled back, trying to hide the nerves that were bubbling up. "Thank you. I'm excited to be here. Nina led Amara to a seating area where the rest of the team was gathered. There was Theo, a soft-spoken but serious sound engineer, and Kai, a laid-back saxophonist who greeted her with a warm handshake. Finally, there was Malik, a well-dressed man who seemed to exude confidence in every step. He was the one who had been in contact with Professor Fitzgerald and had expressed interest in her work. "We've been hearing great things about you, Amara," Malik said, smiling. "Your performance at the festival was incredible. We're really excited to have you here." The compliment made Amara's stomach flutter with both pride and anxiety. She hadn't expected such a warm welcome. Still, she knew she had a lot to prove. The stakes were higher now. It was no longer just about her passion for music, it was about creating something tangible that others would hear and critique. "So, what's the first step?" Amara asked, eager to dive into the work. Nina leaned forward, clearly excited. "Well, we're here to push boundaries, Amara. This project is about blending jazz with elements of electronic music, world music, and even a bit of experimental sounds. We're looking for something that feels fresh, innovative. We want your voice to come through in every note you play. How do you feel about that?" Amara's heart raced. She had always loved experimenting with different genres and sounds. The idea of blending jazz with something new was exciting to her. She had grown up with jazz, but she also had a deep love for other types of music, electronic, indie, even pop. The idea of combining them all was both thrilling and intimidating. "I'm all for it," Amara said, her voice steady but with a spark of enthusiasm. "I love blending different styles. It feels like the perfect challenge." Nina smiled. "Great. We'll start with some initial jams to get a feel for what works. We'll layer sounds, experiment with different rhythms, and see what catches." The next few hours were a blur of music and ideas. Amara sat at the grand piano, her fingers finding their way through familiar jazz standards before they began layering in different sounds and rhythms. Theo worked with the mixing equipment, adjusting the sound, adding electronic layers. Kai played his saxophone, and Malik contributed with his own improvisation on the bass. The music grew, evolving with each minute, and Amara could feel the magic of the collaborative process. But even as the music began to take shape, Amara couldn't help but notice something: she felt slightly out of place. Everyone else seemed so comfortable in this environment, so confident in their craft. Amara had been trained in a very different way, with a strict focus on classical and jazz technique. Here, they were blending genres in ways she had never done before. The freedom was exhilarating, but also unnerving. The following days were filled with long hours in the studio. Amara was challenged in ways she hadn't anticipated. She was asked to stretch her creativity, to think beyond the piano and embrace new textures and sounds. At times, she struggled with the freedom. She was used to structure, to knowing exactly how a piece would unfold, but here there were no boundaries. "Let go, Amara," Nina would say during each session. "Feel the music. Don't think too much. Just play." It was difficult for Amara to silence her inner perfectionist, but with each session, she began to loosen up. She started to experiment with different scales and chords, finding unexpected harmonies. At first, her contributions were small, just a few notes, a few measures, but soon she was adding entire sections, helping to shape the direction of the music. One evening, after an intense session, the team took a break. Amara stepped out onto the studio's rooftop, taking in the breathtaking view of the city below. The lights of New York sparkled in the distance, and she felt a strange sense of connection to the city. For the first time in her life, she was in a place where anything seemed possible. "How are you doing?" Malik's voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to find him standing beside her. "I'm getting there," Amara replied. It's more challenging than I thought. But I'm starting to find my way. I think." Malik nodded. "That's how it works. You start with uncertainty, but you have to trust yourself. You're doing great. I've been impressed with your ability to adapt. Amara smiled, feeling a bit of the weight lift off her shoulders. Maybe she wasn't so out of place after all. Maybe, just maybe, she was exactly where she needed to be. As the days rolled on in New York, Amara's sense of unease slowly began to fade. The initial challenge of stepping into this unfamiliar world, one so different from the classical music and structured environments she had always known, was no longer paralyzing. With every jam session, with every new layer of sound that was added to their growing project, Amara found herself diving deeper into her own creative process. The studio sessions continued into the late hours, sometimes stretching into the early mornings. They worked tirelessly, blending jazz improvisation with electronic beats, layering world rhythms and ambient sounds. Amara had her hands in everything, from the keys of the piano to experimenting with subtle synthesizer lines and atmospheric textures. It felt like she was uncovering parts of herself she had never known existed. But despite all of the progress, there were moments when she still doubted herself. There were times when the sound would be going in one direction, and she couldn't quite keep up. It wasn't that her talent was lacking, she knew she had the chops. But it was the freedom, the lack of boundaries, that sometimes made her feel like she was floundering. One evening, after a particularly challenging session, Amara found herself sitting alone at the piano in the corner of the studio. The others had left for the night, but she wasn't ready to call it quits. The room was quiet now, save for the hum of the lights above. Amara let her fingers graze over the keys, playing a few simple chords as she thought through the past few days. She wasn't sure why, but tonight something felt different. For the first time since she arrived, she didn't feel like an outsider. She wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone, she was just playing for herself, lost in the music. Suddenly, Malik appeared in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim lights from the hallway. "Still here?" he asked, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Amara looked up and smiled. "I couldn't leave. I've been thinking about a few ideas." He stepped into the room and leaned against the wall, listening as she continued to play. For a few minutes, the room was filled with the soft sound of the piano, and then Malik spoke. "You know, Amara," he began, his voice casual but thoughtful, "there's something about your playing that's hard to describe. It's like, you're holding back sometimes. I can hear the potential, but it feels like you're trying to make it sound a certain way, instead of just letting it flow." Amara stopped playing, a little surprised by his words. "I don't know what you mean," she said, frowning. "I'm just trying to get it right." Malik smiled softly. "No, you're trying to make it perfect, and perfection isn't what this project is about. This is about freedom. About you. It's time to let go of all that pressure and just play what you feel. The audience, the critics, they'll hear your heart in it, not just your technique." Amara thought about his words. Let go. She had always been so focused on getting things right, on following the rules of classical music, that the idea of just feeling the music, without restrictions, was almost foreign to her. But it also made sense. The music she'd been working on in New York wasn't about rules, it was about expression, about raw emotion. "All right," she said slowly, a little smile forming on her lips. "I'll try." With that, Amara took a deep breath, her fingers resting on the keys. She stopped thinking about what was expected of her, stopped worrying about whether she was following the right formula. Instead, she allowed herself to just play, whatever came to mind, whatever felt right. The music that flowed from her fingers was different than anything she had played before. There were no constraints, no boundaries. It was unpredictable, a mix of improvisation and emotion. And it felt right. She let the chords ring out, building a melody that rose and fell with an ease that surprised her. It was like unlocking a new side of her talent, a side that had always been there, just waiting to be released. Malik, who had been silent, nodded as he listened. When Amara finished playing, he spoke again. "That's it," he said, his voice full of admiration. "That's the sound we've been looking for. You just had to trust yourself." Amara felt a rush of relief and excitement. She had done it, she had broken through the barrier that had been holding her back. The sound was hers. All hers. And it felt incredible. The following days in the studio were a whirlwind. Amara's newfound confidence was contagious. The team picked up on the shift in her playing, and with that, the music began to take shape in ways they hadn't imagined before. The layers they had been building were starting to feel cohesive, and Amara's piano lines blended seamlessly with the other instruments. They began recording full takes, layering in electronic sounds, blending jazz rhythms, and incorporating elements from other genres. Amara's role in the project became clearer, and her ideas started influencing the direction of the album. She wasn't just playing her part anymore, she was helping to shape the entire sound. Nina, the producer, often praised her for the depth of her ideas. "You've got a real sense of balance, Amara," she said one afternoon. "You're bringing the music together in ways we hadn't anticipated." Despite the pressure and the long hours, Amara felt more at home in the studio than she ever had in her life. There was a rhythm to it, a flow between the musicians and the sound engineers that felt like a dance. They were all working toward the same goal, but each person brought their own unique energy to the table. By the end of the week, the team had created a rough cut of several tracks. Amara listened to the playback, her heart swelling with pride. This wasn't just a recording. This was a piece of her, a piece of all of them. The blend of genres, the unconventional sounds, it was unlike anything she had ever heard before. "We're close," Malik said as the team gathered around the playback system. "But we're not done yet. There's still more to refine." Amara nodded, eager to dive back in. But for the first time in days, she allowed herself to take a step back and soak in what they had accomplished. This was only the beginning, but it was already something she was proud of. As Amara stepped out of the studio that night, she couldn't help but smile. The city was still alive, the streets lit up with the neon glow of the nightlife. She had come to New York to find herself as an artist, and in many ways, she already had. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but she knew one thing for sure, she was ready for whatever came next. The energy in the studio was palpable as the project neared completion. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of late-night sessions, musical breakthroughs, and moments of self-doubt. But through it all, Amara had grown, not just as a musician, but as an artist. Her sound had evolved, and her confidence had grown with each passing day. The music was finally taking shape, and she could hear it, a fusion of jazz, electronic, and world influences, all tied together by her unmistakable piano voice. But now, as the final touches were being added, a new tension started to creep into her thoughts. The album was nearing its finish, and soon, it would be time for the world to hear it. The idea of releasing her music to the public, to have critics and fans judge it, was both exciting and terrifying. For the first time in her career, Amara would be vulnerable, and she wasn't sure how ready she was for that. The studio doors swung open one morning to reveal Malik, who was holding a stack of papers. His eyes gleamed with a mixture of excitement and concern. "The first round of feedback has come in," he said. "It's time to hear what the critics think." Amara felt her stomach tighten. She knew it was coming, but hearing Malik's words made it all feel very real. The last few weeks had been such a personal journey for her. The music they had created wasn't just a product, it was her soul on display. How would the world receive it? Would they understand her vision? Or would they dismiss it as just another experiment? "We've got some really positive reactions," Malik continued, sensing her apprehension. "But there are some tough critiques, too. Some people are concerned about how out there it is. They're not sure if it'll resonate with mainstream audiences." The words stung more than Amara expected. She had always been confident in her sound, confident that this fusion of genres was something new, something that could connect with listeners on a deeper level. But hearing that there were doubts started to chip away at that confidence. Theo, who had been busy adjusting some sound levels in the corner, looked up. I think they're missing the point. This album isn't supposed to sound like everything else. It's pushing boundaries. Nina nodded. Exactly. There's always going to be people who don't get it at first. But we're making something real. Something that stands out. Amara took a deep breath, looking around at the team. They believed in her. They believed in the project. And that meant something. So what now? She asked, her voice steady. Malik looked thoughtful for a moment. We have a choice. We can take the feedback and try to change things to appease the critics, or we can stand by the music and push forward with what we believe. The decision is yours, Amara. For a moment, everything went quiet. Amara felt the weight of the decision pressing on her shoulders. She had been through so much to get to this point, and now the very thing that had gotten her here, the raw, unapologetic music, was being questioned. But as she sat there, she realized that she knew exactly what she had to do. This album, this music is me, Amara said, her voice firm. It's everything I've worked for, everything I've felt. If people don't understand it now, that's okay. It's about staying true to who I am. We're not here to please everyone. We're here to make something real. Malik grinned, clearly proud. I like that. Let's finish this. The next few weeks were a blur. The team continued to refine the album, adding the finishing touches to the tracks. But through it all, Amara remained focused. She refused to let the criticism derail her or make her second-guess herself. The music was ready. It was the product of countless hours of hard work and personal growth, and it deserved to be heard. Finally, the day came when the album was ready for release. The team gathered in the studio, looking at the final track list, the artwork, and the marketing materials. It was time. The world would soon hear what they had created. I can't believe it's finally happening, Amara said, her voice a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. You've earned this, Nina replied with a smile. We all have. Malik clapped his hands together. All right, team. We're about to release something huge. Let's make sure the world knows it. And so, the album was released into the world. Within hours, social media exploded with reactions. Some fans loved it, sharing how they felt the music resonated with them. Others were unsure, questioning the genre fusion and the unconventional sounds. As expected, there were both praise and criticism. Amara sat in the studio, her laptop open, refreshing the feed as the comments and reviews flooded in. Her heart raced with every notification, and the feedback was both uplifting and challenging. A few hours later, she received an email from the largest music review site in the industry. They had written a full review of the album. Amara's hands shook slightly as she clicked open the email and began to read. The review was mixed, but it was mostly positive. It praised the album for its boldness, for pushing the boundaries of jazz and electronic music. But it also mentioned that it might be too experimental for some listeners. Still, the overall tone was supportive, encouraging listeners to embrace the new sound. Amara closed her laptop with a deep sigh, the weight of the release still settling in. But then, a comment caught her attention. It was from a fan who had seen her perform at the festival months ago. I was at the festival when Amara played her piece, the comment read. Seeing her play was life-changing. This album is a reflection of that power. She's changing the game, and I'm here for it. A smile spread across Amara's face as she read those words. It was a small comment, but it meant everything. This was why she had done it. This was why she had pushed through the self-doubt and the fear of failure. She wasn't just making music. She was connecting with people. And that was the most important thing. As the days went by, more and more people began to appreciate the album for what it was, an innovative fusion of genres that had never been heard before. The initial skepticism started to fade, replaced by curiosity and admiration for what Amara and her team had accomplished. Critics began to acknowledge the boldness of the work, and even the toughest reviewers started to come around. But the best part was that Amara had stayed true to herself. She had faced her doubts, her critics, and her fears, and she had emerged stronger, knowing that the music was hers, and it would continue to evolve in ways she hadn't even imagined yet. As weeks passed, the buzz around Amara's album grew. The world was beginning to recognize what the team had created, and it was undeniable, the music was making waves. From glowing reviews in the music industry to fan reactions on social media, the album was carving out a unique space for itself in the world of music. But with the praise came something else. The pressure. The spotlight was on her now, and it was brighter than she had ever imagined. Amara sat backstage at her first major press event since the album's release. She had never liked these kinds of events, the bright lights, the endless cameras, the barrage of questions about her music and her creative process. But tonight, it was different. Tonight, she was going to step into this new reality as a fully fledged artist, one who had something to say. She felt the familiar stirrings of anxiety in her stomach as her publicist, Rachel, went over the details one last time. "Remember, Amara," Rachel said, her voice low but firm, "you've got this. Just be yourself. You've already proven that the music speaks for itself. You don't need to overthink it." Amara nodded, though she didn't feel entirely convinced. Despite the success of the album, the idea of speaking in front of a room full of journalists, all eager to dissect her work, made her uneasy. It wasn't that she was ashamed of her music, it was the opposite. She felt too strongly about it, too personally attached. Talking about it in a way that would make sense to others felt almost like giving up a part of herself. "You okay?" Malik's voice broke through her thoughts, and she looked up to find him standing nearby, his casual demeanor at odds with the formality of the setting. Amara offered him a tight smile. "I guess I'm just nervous. I don't really like talking about my music like that. I'd rather just play it." Malik grinned. "I get it. But hey, if there's anyone who can talk about their art with passion, it's you." Amara rolled her eyes playfully, but his words offered a small comfort. It wasn't like she hadn't spoken about her music before, she had, plenty of times, especially with the team. But this felt different. The room full of strangers, the expectations, it all felt like too much to handle at once. Before she could respond, a voice came over the intercom, announcing that the press event was about to begin. "Here we go," Rachel said, flashing her a smile before walking toward the door. "Remember, stay grounded, stay real. You've got this." Amara stood up, taking a deep breath. Her palms were sweating, but she forced herself to smile as she followed Rachel into the press room. The lights hit her as soon as she stepped through the doorway, and she saw the rows of journalists, their cameras trained on her, notebooks open, ready to capture every word. She took a seat at the front of the room, her heart racing. It was happening. This was her moment. The press conference began, and for the first few minutes, the questions came fast and furious. The journalists wanted to know about her influences, about the creative process behind the album. They asked her to explain the fusion of genres, how she had managed to blend classical elements with jazz and electronic music. They wanted to know why she had chosen to take such a risk with her sound. At first, Amara felt like she was treading water. She answered their questions politely, but the words felt rehearsed, like she was simply going through the motions. She was still trying to figure out how to explain her music, how to articulate the emotions behind it without sounding too abstract or too vague. Then, a familiar voice came through the microphone, a journalist who had been following Amara's journey from the very beginning. His name was Derek, and he had written about Amara's breakthrough performance at the festival months ago. "Derek from the Music Review," he said, giving her a nod. "Amara, your album has garnered a lot of attention for its boldness and experimental nature. But there are still a lot of critics who feel it's too unconventional, too out there. How do you respond to those who believe you've gone too far with this project? The question hit Amara like a punch to the gut. She had known it was coming. Critics were always going to question her choices, especially when she was pushing the boundaries of what people expected. But hearing it in front of this room full of strangers made her heart race. She could feel the eyes on her, waiting for her answer. For a moment, she paused. Her hands were still on the table, gripping the edge as if it could steady her. The weight of the question felt heavy, but then something clicked inside her. She was no longer the unsure girl who had stepped into the studio months ago. She had found her voice. She had found herself. With a deep breath, Amara looked up, meeting Derek's gaze. "I think that's exactly the point," she said, her voice steady. "Music is supposed to challenge us. It's supposed to make us feel something. And if I hadn't taken that risk, I wouldn't have made the album I'm proud of today. I've always believed that the best art comes from pushing boundaries. I didn't make this album to fit into a box. I made it because it's who I am. It's the music I wanted to make, and I'm not sorry for that." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. And then, slowly, the journalists began to nod, the tension easing. Derek smiled, clearly impressed. "I think that's the most honest answer I've heard all day," he said. "Thank you, Amara." As the press event continued, Amara felt the shift. She was no longer just answering questions, she was engaging with the room. She was speaking her truth, and the more she did it, the more confident she became. It was as if, with every word, she was reinforcing her place in the world of music, not just as a talented musician, but as someone who had something to say. When the event finally wrapped up, and Amara stepped off the stage, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. The spotlight hadn't swallowed her. In fact, it had done the opposite. It had helped her find her strength. Malik was waiting for her backstage, a proud smile on his face. "You killed it," he said, giving her a quick hug. "You're not just a musician, Amara. You're an artist. You own that room." Amara smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "Thanks, Malik. I think I'm starting to believe that myself." As she left the press conference and headed out into the bustling streets of New York, Amara felt something shift deep within her. She was no longer the unsure girl who had arrived in the city months ago. She was someone different now, someone confident in her art, her voice, and her place in the world. And no matter what came next, she was ready for it. The day after the press event, Amara stood at the window of her apartment, looking out over the New York skyline. The city felt different now. Everything felt different. It wasn't just that her album had been released, or that the press was beginning to recognize her for what she had created, it was something deeper. A shift had occurred within her. Her journey had never been easy. From the struggle to find her own sound to battling with insecurities and facing criticism, it had been a series of challenges. But every one of those challenges had shaped her into who she was today, a confident artist, unapologetic in her choices and ready to face whatever came next. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Malik. "Malik, let's meet at the studio later. I have a surprise for you." Amara smiled. She had no idea what the surprise was, but she had learned to trust Malik's instincts. He was always full of energy and ideas, and he had been a key part of her journey from the beginning. She quickly got ready and made her way to the studio, her heart light with anticipation. As she entered, Malik was there, pacing excitedly. "You're not going to believe this," he said as soon as she walked in. "We've got an offer for a world tour." Amara froze, her mind racing. A world tour. She had dreamed of this moment, but it had always felt so far away, something distant, something other artists did. The thought of performing her music to audiences across the globe seemed impossible just a year ago. Now, here it was, staring her in the face. A tour, she repeated, her voice a little shaky with excitement. Are you serious? Malik laughed. Dead serious. The response to the album has been huge. We're talking Europe, Asia, even Australia. It's everything we've been working toward. Amara felt a surge of emotion as she processed the news. She had worked tirelessly to get to this point, pouring her heart and soul into her music. Now, the world was about to hear it, every note, every chord, every word. I can't believe this is happening, she whispered, a smile spreading across her face. I thought it was just a dream. It's your reality now, Malik said, placing a hand on her shoulder. This is just the beginning. Amara took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing thoughts. A world tour. The idea was overwhelming, but at the same time, it felt right. She had never imagined it would come so soon, but now that it was here, she was ready. She was more than ready. Later that evening, Amara sat down with her team to discuss the logistics of the tour. There was so much to plan: travel schedules, concert venues, rehearsals, and, of course, the music itself. But amidst the excitement, there was a calmness to the process. Amara could feel the weight of the journey ahead, but she also felt prepared. She had fought for her place in the industry, and now she was about to step onto some of the biggest stages in the world. As they went through the details, Amara couldn't help but think back to where it all began, that little girl sitting at the piano, dreaming of something bigger. She had come so far. It wasn't just about the music anymore, it was about the impact she could have. About connecting with people in a way that was deeper than the notes she played. About sharing her story and her struggles with the world. Let's make this tour unforgettable, she said to her team, her voice filled with determination. We're not just playing shows. We're changing lives. One song at a time. The days leading up to the tour were a whirlwind. Amara spent hours in the studio perfecting her setlist, rehearsing with her band, and making sure everything was ready for the first performance. She was still processing everything that had happened, how quickly everything had come together. The pressure was high, but Amara had learned how to handle it. She had learned how to trust herself, her music, and the people around her. Finally, the day of the tour's first performance arrived. The venue was massive, packed with eager fans from all over the world. As Amara stood backstage, waiting for the moment when she would step out onto that stage, she felt a mix of emotions. Nerves. Excitement. Gratitude. When her name was called, the crowd erupted in cheers. The sound was deafening. Amara took a deep breath, then walked out onto the stage, the lights blinding her for a moment. The roar of the crowd was overwhelming, but in that moment, she felt completely at home. This was where she was meant to be. The music began, and she let it flow through her. Every chord, every melody, every beat felt like a part of her, a piece of her soul being shared with the world. She could see the faces of the audience, some of them singing along, others simply closing their eyes and losing themselves in the music. Amara knew that this was the connection she had always wanted. It was more than just the notes, it was about the emotion behind them. The shared experience. As she played, she thought about everything that had led her to this moment. The struggles. The doubts. The triumphs. And the people who had stood by her along the way. She had come so far, but the journey was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. After the show, as Amara stood in her dressing room, covered in sweat from the performance, she allowed herself a moment to take it all in. The cheers, the applause, the overwhelming sense of accomplishment. But beyond that, there was something even more important. Something deeper. She had found her purpose. She had found her place in the world. The world tour was just the beginning. There were more stages to conquer, more songs to write, and more people to connect with. Amara knew there would be challenges ahead, there always were, but she also knew that she was ready. She had faced the toughest battles and emerged stronger each time. She looked at the reflection in the mirror, a smile playing on her lips. This is just the start, she whispered to herself. The world is waiting. And with that, Amara walked back into the world, ready to take on whatever came next. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?